I'm endlessly fascinated and curious about the world around us, about business, about politics, about the arts, about culture, developments, social issues, and the people. Most importantly, about the people that are shaping our future. Every night, I get the opportunity to have conversations, to dive into conversations with thought leaders, with change makers, entrepreneurs, politicians, and everyday heroes who unpack the ideas and stories that I think matter to all of us. What's the future of our economy? What's the future of our country? How do we build stronger communities? What can we learn from music, theater, sports, politics, the arts? How does policy shape our real lives? What does leadership look like, real leadership in today's environment? If it's interesting and relevant and topical and we're talking about it, you'll hear about it here at 6 o'clock on the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. I want to have real conversations, in-depth conversations. These are ideas we're sharing. This is the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. Thanks for joining me. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. I'm going to do something a little bit different tonight. This is not going to be a 5 headlines and a hot take conversations. We're going to take a big step back conversation tonight about the world we're actually moving in today at the start of 2026 and what assumptions we need and may need to retire if we want to navigate 2026 with our eyes open. My guest tonight is Professor Stephen R. Nagy, a Canadian that's teaching and researching in Tokyo. He's a professor of politics and international studies at the International Christian University. He's a long-term analyst of Indo-Pacific geopolitics and great power competition. And he's been writing in a deliberately very provocative way the last couple of weeks about, I think, 3 big ideas. Number 1, Trump's what he calls curated chaos. Not as randomness, but as method. Number 2, what certain moves in places like Venezuela might imply and not imply for flashpoints like Taiwan. And the bigger frame, whether we're actually living through a messy transition or whether the system is still fundamentally a bipolar world of US versus China, with everyone else adapting, hedging, and absorbing the shock. So tonight, we're going to challenge some assumptions, and we're going to do it calmly, analytically, and with a global lens from Japan, Tokyo, with Stephen, but also obviously thinking about what the impact is on Canadians. Professor Nagy, welcome back to the show.
Thanks, Brian, and Happy New Year to you. It's great to be back.
Happy New Year to you. So you've written a year-end set of arguments that you actually say that you mean to provoke. What is one assumption you think Canadians need to be thinking about right now in regards to where the world is?
Well, I think there's 2 big pictures there, Brian. One is about our neighbor, the United States, and its leader, President Trump. And the second is what kind of world are we going into? I think and let's start with that last one. What kind of world we're going into? I think Canadians, at least since the 1990s, have had some kind of view that we're a middle power and that Canada can go out and change the world, and that we should be advocating for democracy very, very explicitly, and human rights and human security. And I think that the world is where we are today is we have 3 great powers, the United States and China, which are head and shoulders above everybody else. And then we have Russia, which I don't think is so much a great power, but a great disruptor. And then we have the rest of the world, and whether it's India or it's Japan or Southeast Asia, the gap between them and China and the United States is enormous in terms of comprehensive power. And what this means is that we're not going into a world where power is distributed equally amongst states and that we can make decisions in a democratic way. What it means is that 2 big countries, the US and China, really are setting the table, and they're driving the rules of the road and how the world is developing. And everybody else, whether it's Canada or Japan or South Korea or Southeast Asia or India, really has to adjust to how these 2 big powers are negotiating their friction. And this is a huge challenge, and I think it creates many questions for Canada. What kind of world do we want to live in? Do we, as Mr. Carney is visiting Beijing next week, do we continue to try and build relations with China? Or do we invest in, I think, our geographic neighbor, our closest neighbor, our closest partner by far, the United States, and try to enhance its power globally so it can outcompete authoritarian China. This is where we sit in terms of the big picture, and I don't think that those numbers are going to change. Um, you know, if we were to put some countries together, India and Japan, their comprehensive power doesn't meet China's. So even, building and working with these countries, we're not going to be able to surpass China. And of course, the United States is head and shoulders above that. So
So is
let me
sorry, go
finish. We're
ahead.
clearly in a bipolar world, and that means we have to make choices as Canadians where we want to sit and who we want to influence and who we can influence. And I think that's the United States. We should be tying ourselves to the United States, but also doing that cautiously because the authoritarian China is not the choice that I think Canada wants to make or should make as we are trying to negotiate this bipolar world.
So multilateralism is dead, gone, history?
Multilateralism is on life support at best. I think as we move forward, we're going to see multilateralism become much less effective. We're going to see something called minilateralism appear, and that's smaller groupings of countries that are focused on specific agendas and specific roles in the region. So a good example is fighting illegal, unregulated, and undocumented fishing. You have 4 or 5 countries in the South China Sea or up in the Aleutian Islands, and they're working together to stop illegal fishing. That would be an example of minilateral partnerships. But others are looking at maritime domain awareness and trying to stop North Korean weapons of mass destruction. We also have minilateral cooperation in terms of dealing with piracy on the seas. But this idea of large-scale minilateralism to deal with global problems, I think, for the foreseeable future, really is on life support at best.
So our Prime Minister Mark Carney has been to Europe numerous times. He's been to Qatar. He's, as you
Yep.
mentioned, traveling the world, including Beijing. Is that all a lost cause? He should just worry about Washington and nothing else?
Of course not. But our closest partner, our enduring partner, that relationship that we have over I think it's more than $100 billion of trade a month with the United States. This is not going to change. And, the Europeans are not going to ever replace the United States in terms of our biggest trading partner. China can't replace the United States as our biggest trading partner. So as we think about where Canada is going, we need to make sure that this relationship is the most stable, most positive for Canadians as possible. But at the same time, I think we need to build some partnerships with reliable countries. And again, Mr. Carney is visiting Beijing this week. The big question for me, this is his second trip to Asia. Why isn't he visiting our most important and closest partners, Japan and South Korea? Big questions. And again, this speaks to long-term relationships with China, likely elite capture, and I think the China lobby in Canada, which is hugely problematic for Canadian interests.
You said we have to have a stable relationship with the United States, but
Yes,
yet in one of your articles, you liked the phrase, you used the phrase Trump's curated chaos.
yes.
And so, with your claim that chaos, you say, is not Trump's enemy, you say it's his instrument. What does that look like in practice as a foreign policy strategy?
It's a huge challenge, but I think when we look at leaders, comparable leaders, and in that essay that you're relating, I bring up Mao Zedong. And of course, Mr. Trump is no mass murderer. He's nothing like that. But one of the similarities between Mao Zedong, the first post-World War leader for China, and Mr. Trump is their delight in chaos. They like chaos in their governing. They like chaos amongst their political opponents. And this is how they, unbalance rivals. This is how they push through policy. This is how they dominate the political discussions in a way that's very difficult, I think, for traditional politicians to manage, because traditional politicians are the complete opposite. They want to avoid chaos. They want order. They want predictability. But Mr. Trump, like leaders like Mr. Mao Zedong, celebrate and enjoy chaos because again, it's a way to unsettle their opponents and ensure that their priorities are always front and center, rather than having to negotiate with opponents or even allies in the political sphere. And the comparison's fascinating, but again, Mr. Trump is anything but orthodox in how he governs. And this is not an endorsement or an admonishment. Rather, I think we have to just be realistic that this is the kind of political leader he is, and this is how he tries to achieve his political objectives.
Many people think that his chaos is sort of accidental or unprecedented, and you use the word curated chaos. So you obviously believe that it's curated, it's planned, it's organized, it's chaos that's organized. Really?
I think his modus operandus is in general to always unsettle his adversaries, those people that he's negotiating with, through this kind of chaotic behavior. It's not something that is unplanned, and we've seen so many examples of this where he welcomes President Zelensky to the office, to the White House. He berates him, and then 2 weeks later they have bon ami in the Vatican, and they've come to some kind of deal. And we've seen this in his first term. We've seen it in his whole life as a negotiator and a television personality, and now we've seen it in the second Trump administration, where again he's fluctuating and moving back between these very competitive and critical relationships with whether it's the Europeans or President Zelensky or President Xi or Secretary General Kim in North Korea, and then he praises them and reaches out and tries to engage. And again, it's a pattern of behavior that we need to watch. How Canada negotiates this, I think the big advantage that we have today is we have a technocrat, a disciplined Prime Minister Mark Carney, that his first reaction is not to get off the plane and criticize the Trump administration. He gets off the plane and gets to work and finds out how he could negotiate with the Trump administration or build stronger partnerships abroad. So we're in a different situation in terms of negotiating with chaos, and I think we're better positioned with the current Prime Minister.
Many people think that this curated chaos is sort of unprecedented, and you've argued in your article that it's not as unprecedented as people think. It's sort of like old school statecraft. You've mentioned obviously already Mao Zedong. Do you really think that other people have used this curated chaos in the past and used it effectively?
Mr. Trump does it in a slightly different manner, but I think when we look back at U.S. presidents, if we look at Bill Clinton, he was a master at distracting the press. And, he had a few different scandals, and, he had a penchant for cigars in the White House, as you know. And he was able to distract, I think, the media to prioritize his economic policies. When we look back, President Nixon was like this. President Nixon engaged in criminal activity, but at the same time, he reached out to the Chinese and normalized relations. When we look back at U.S. history, it's a history of political leaders moving between chaos and rewriting rules, whether it is getting off the gold standard or the oil shock, or again, Bill Clinton and his activities in office, and now President Trump in office. They're comfortable with revisionism and rewriting rules. And this is in the United States DNA. But again, we can look back at leaders around the world, whether it is Mao Zedong, whether it is Stalin, whether it is Hitler. And I'm not saying Mr. Trump is a mass murderer like these individuals, or Richelieu or others, is that consequential political leaders are disciplined, but they're also comfortable in negotiating chaos. And that unsettles and unbalances their political opponents and allows them to achieve some of their political objectives. And I think this is, again, if we look at Trump over the long term and compare it to other leaders, he's very much one of those leaders, just with American characteristics.
In business, I had a similar kind of a adversary slash person to negotiate with, and a lawyer said, "Well, this is just the theory of outrageous negotiation,
Yes.
and so when it's outrageous negotiation, you can't be outrageous back. You just got to be completely reasonable all the time." So let me ask you, what's the way that Canada or the EU or Japan or South Korea have got to deal with this? Is it flattery and transactional deal making, or is it autonomy? Or is it coalition building with other allies? How do you combat this chaotic United States?
Well, we know what doesn't work, and I hate to bring up our old Prime Minister Trudeau. But when President Trump was elected in November in 2025, he flew down to Mar-a-Lago, had a steak, and then came back to Canada, got off the plane, and the first thing he said, it was a setback for women that Kamala Harris was not elected president of the United States. This is not how you endear yourself to your closest political partner. Rather, he should have he could think whatever he wants, but he should have kept that to himself. And under Prime Minister Trudeau, and we had many of these kinds of open criticisms of, I think, President Trump and the MAGA supporters. And I'm not endorsing either. But this is not how you engage in politics with your closest partner. And here, I think Prime Minister Mark Carney has been much better. He's been disciplined. Has had a sense of humor. He's talked about the relationship between the two and how Canada is essential for making America great again. He's been complimentary in terms of many things not happening without President Trump's pressure, whether it's increasing military spending or with NATO or in Canada. These have all been, I think, an important and different approach than Prime Minister Trudeau. Where and how can we do this? I think coalition building is very important, but we've been unsuccessful. After the Liberation Day tariffs, we would have thought the Japanese and the South Koreans and the Australians and Canadians would have come together and said, if you do this, President Trump, we'll put tariffs on you at the same time. They didn't. And the simple reason is that they prioritized their security partnership and their comprehensive partnership with the United States over increased tariffs. And this is, I think, counterintuitive because we
Or
thought
maybe we all learned something from the 1930s and the Hoots-Marley tariffs, where
absolutely.
everyone reciprocated, and we caused a great worldwide depression. Wasn't a smart
Absolutely.
move.
And again, I think this is when we are thinking about how to manage President Trump's chaos and tariffs, again, is sit back. What does he really want? We know that he has a maximalist approach in terms of negotiating, and then he eventually comes down to something that's much more reasonable. We saw this in the first term. We're already seeing it in the second term. And again, this means that as we're Canadians thinking about how to manage this relationship, is put something on the table that's meaningful, give him a take home. Again, I think a respectful diplomatic dialogue is really important. But at the same time, President Trump has demonstrated that he respects strength, respects strong leaders and disciplined leaders. And again, without being a strong and disciplined leader, that's again a winner, as I think the president uses. It's difficult to find that window where he's willing to compromise and come to a shared bargain. So as Canada's thinking about this relationship, again, we have to demonstrate strength. And I think our prime minister has done a pretty good job here. He's demonstrated that he's interested in diversifying away from the United States, which I think is mixed. And he's demonstrated a kind of respect for Mr. Trump publicly, which I think plays well to President Trump's ego. Where I think we could do better is lining up our partners before we negotiate with China. So again, Mr. Carney is going to be in Beijing next week. I really don't understand why he didn't stop in Tokyo before, sign some kind of economic security and trade partnership with Japan before going to China. Going with leverage rather than going without leverage. So these kinds of sequencing, these kinds of relationships, again, helps us not only negotiate with Beijing, but it also helps us negotiate with Washington as well.
Did Japan learn something in Trump 1.0 that the world can learn?
Yes, they isolated the relationship with the president from the institutions and the military and economic partnerships. So we saw the late Prime Minister Shinzo Abe basically, sycophantically engage with Mr. Trump. He hosted Mr. Trump and introduced him to the emperor. They had a sumo tournament and gave it, and they called it the President's Cup. Um, every opportunity to put Mr. Trump front and center in the relationship and demonstrate the importance of the United States and President Trump in the alliance partnership. That was done at the leadership level. And then at the military level, at the economic level, at the think tank level, at the politicians level, in the first Trump administration, we saw on both sides, on the US side and the Japanese side, literally hundreds of visitors on both sides to try and stabilize the relationship. And that was kind of the ballast that kept the relationship stable. And I think this time around as well, this is what we've seen the Japanese do, is that try to isolate and keep the Trump administration, the leader relationship good. Do all the stuff that I think President Trump expects because he's understands himself as the most powerful person on the planet, but ensure that the think tanks and the politicians and the business leaders and the military officials have upped their exchanges and the dialogues to create that very, very thick layer of relationships under the president that can insulate the relationship and protect the relationships from some of the chaos that, of course, President Trump is very comfortable with.
We're going to take a break for some messages, and when we come back, I'm going to ask Stephen Nagy, Professor Nagy, about Venezuela. And is it a precedent that we should be worried about? Stay with us, everyone. Back in 2 minutes. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. We've got Professor Stephen Nagy with us tonight. He's in Tokyo, Japan. He's a professor there. He's a Canadian, and so he's got, I think, a really interesting perspective of Canada from afar, and particularly Canada in regards to its relationship with Asia. So I got to ask you, you have argued that Venezuela is not a comparable or a precedent to Taiwan. A lot of people are very worried that that Venezuela is a precedent to Taiwan or to Kyiv, and that Xi and or Putin could make use of the same arguments that Donald Trump is using to attack Kyiv or Taiwan. You say no. Why? Why is Venezuela not a template?
Brian, it's a super question, and I think for the Kyiv and of course Taipei are different examples, but we've already seen what an ill-prepared invasion of a country. What are the consequences when we look at how Russia is trapped in the quagmire of Ukraine today? It's lost perhaps 700 to 800,000 men. Many more have come back to Russia maimed, and that the Russian economy is going to deal with this for the next generation. And of course, Russia has lost millions of citizens that have left and to come live in Western Europe or other parts of the world to avoid being enlisted into the army. So Ukraine is actually the best example of why I think an invasion of Taipei or a green light being given to China after the invasion of Venezuela is really not a green light. Actually, I think it's the complete opposite. Now, if we think about Taiwan itself, Taiwan it has great deterrence capabilities, which means that it can cause a lot of pain to whatever country is about to invade it or try to invade it. It has the Taiwan Strait, which is incredibly difficult to cross, and there's only a small window of opportunity to actually invade Taiwan. It also has friends, and Taiwan's position in semiconductor supply chains, its position in sea lines of communication, I'm going to come back to the numbers here, mean that what happens to Taiwan actually matters to the global economy. Let me give you some numbers. The sea lanes of communication that go around Taiwan, that ferry imports and exports and energy resources, we think about 2.3 trillion US dollars a year go in and around those sea lines of communication. So, that's a big sum. That's about the size of the Canadian economy. We also know that the most sophisticated semiconductors produced by the Taiwanese semiconductor manufacturing company are produced in Taiwan. And if there was a conflict across the Taiwan Strait, of course, these semiconductor supply chains would completely break down. And once that happens, that the iPad that you just bought your daughter or your son, it goes from $1,000 to $5,000 overnight. The inflationary pressures that would happen because of the breakdown in semiconductor supply chains, but again, supply chains in general would have dramatic inflationary pressures on the global economy. But of course, a conflict across the Taiwan Straits would be completely devastating for the Chinese economy, the Taiwanese economy, and likely the Japanese and South Korean and Southeast Asian economies. So a war would unleash really a breakdown in the global economy in a way that, again, Venezuela, it just not going to have, it just didn't have that effect because Venezuela is not a key part of the global economy. It's a key part of the narcotic economy, but it certainly isn't a key part of the technological economy that Taiwan is. There's no sea lines of communication in and around Venezuela that can be disrupted in the way that it would disrupt all the economies in Asia. They're just completely different figures. And I think all of this means that many countries have a huge interest in protecting Taiwan, but the Chinese themselves understand the consequences of a failed reunification with Taiwan would likely be a destroyed economy and likely a change in their political system. And I don't think the Chinese Communist Party is willing to make that bet.
But the U.S. didn't, at least so far, invade Venezuela. They
No,
just surgically came in and took out the president. Could
right.
China do the same thing?
I think that nobody knows for certain. To be honest, they do practice. In the Mongolian desert, they have a makeup of the Taiwanese presidential office. So they do practice going in and doing these kinds of operations. But I think again the calculus is very, very different. What would be the consequences of doing something like that? Could the Chinese get in and out without causing a conflict? What would the United States do in terms of its reaction? It does have a legal obligation to defend Taiwan under certain circumstances. Would this disrupt the sea lines of communication? And we just don't know. But at this stage, we think that China probably doesn't have the capabilities to do this or to have the capabilities without this cascading into a serious, serious, serious conflict. So, anything is possible, but we generally think that this kind of action by China is probably unlikely. If the Russians couldn't do this with President Zelensky, we generally think that the Chinese would have a much, much more difficult time doing this with President Lai.
Donald Trump is saying similar things about Cuba, about Colombia, about Panama, about Greenland, and frankly, a little bit about Canada.
Mhm.
So you don't think it's a precedent? You really don't think Venezuela is a precedent?
I think Venezuela is a precedent for getting involved in different countries by the United States. But when we look at China's interests, its interest is dominating the East China Sea, dominating the South China Sea, bringing Taiwan back to the mainland peacefully. It wants to dominate the Himalayan plateau, but its risk calculus is much, much, much lower than I think Russia or the United States. Understanding that to achieve a lot of these objectives that China is interested in very quickly would cause a conflict that would have global consequences. And I think that they're not willing to make that bet. Their long-term calculus is that keep the economy growing, keep increasing their diplomatic influence within the region and globally, and that they could compel Taiwan to come back to China through other kinds of non-kinetic or non-military pressure. We'll never know unless it really happens. But again, I think that the Venezuelan example shouldn't be applied to how the Chinese think about Taiwan. But I think the Venezuelan example is something that, if I was Cuban or Colombian or some of these other states, I'd be very concerned about what the United States is going to do next.
So let's talk about deterrence then. I think that one of the major reasons why China hasn't done something is because, as you mentioned, the U.S. has a legal obligation to defend Taiwan, and so therefore there's deterrence. Given this curated chaos, this unpredictability that Donald Trump has, does that increase the deterrence or does that decrease the deterrence because you just don't know whether you can count on him anymore?
I think it depends on, who you are. From the Chinese point of view, Brian, during President Trump's first term, he was serving Secretary General Xi Jinping some chocolate cake at Mar-a-Lago, and he reached over and whispered into his ear and said, I just sent, 37 Tomahawk missiles to Syria to destroy some terrorists. I mean, this is pretty unpredictable. I don't know about you and your chocolate cake. I usually prefer it with a coffee, not 37 Tomahawk missiles. So I think when the Chinese are looking at President Trump, they look at this individual that has the capacity to do almost anything unpredictably. And that could include not coming to help Taiwan, frankly. But because they don't know the ambiguity, it means that the Chinese don't want to take a risk at again, provoking President Trump in a way that could unleash some kind of response that, again, could further hurt the Chinese economy. Right now, Brian, I think from Secretary General Xi Jinping's point of view, the biggest worry that he has every day is not so much Mr. Trump or Taiwan, it's the domestic economy. They have 20%, maybe 26% youth unemployment. The property bubble has burst. Consumption is collapsing. The production domestically is the prices are down, so they're producing more, but it's doubling down on a failed economic model. They have huge, huge problems, and they want to get those problems solved. And sparking a conflict over Taiwan or in the South China Sea that could potentially put more downward pressure on the Chinese economy just isn't, I think, where the Chinese Communist Party sits. Actually, I think they sit on the other side. They understand that if their economy does have more problems, that the political stability within the system could be destabilized. And this is their deepest worry, that a destabilizing economy could destabilize the one-party regime, the one-party state. And that's bad news for the party, and it's bad news for China.
We're going to take a break for some messages. When we come back, I'm going to ask our expert about this argument that he's making about a bipolar world. And is that a change or is that just the reality of today? Many people are thinking that this world carved up into three spheres of influence is terrible. But maybe it's just the reality of where we are today. We're going to take a break, everyone. Be back in just 2 minutes. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. I've got Professor Stephen Nagy from Tokyo with us tonight. He's a Canadian that teaches and does research in Tokyo. But as a Canadian, I think it's really interesting that he's got this external point of view of what's going on worldwide, and also obviously as how it impacts Canada. Particularly after this attack on Venezuela, the cartoonists have gone crazy on social media and in newspapers, carving up the world into Putin's sphere, Xi's sphere, and Trump's sphere. And really, they've talked about this not bipolar, but sort of tripolar world. And you argued that it's a bipolar world, and a lot of us, before Venezuela, thought it was a multipolar world. What's the reality today?
As I mentioned, the comprehensive power of the United States and China is head and shoulders above everybody else. And for your listeners, you might want to put these in your notes, Brian, for your listeners. But power indexes such as the Lowy Institute's Power Index, they basically show that China and the United States are head and shoulders, 30 or 40 points above the closest countries, India and Japan. And other power measures also demonstrate that China and the United States are way ahead in terms of comprehensive power. So if we're using this kind of development or these kinds of assessments, of course we're in a bipolar world. The Chinese economy is about $18 trillion. The American economy is about $31 trillion. After that, it's the Indian economy at $4 trillion.
31, 18, 4.
Yes. And I mean, this is, money matters. Money translates to power. And again, the United States and China are head and shoulders above. So, if you make the assumption that size of the economy translates into absolute power, which I do, then US and China are head and shoulders above everybody else. And if we look at the United States in general and we think about the kinds of partnerships it has globally, and of course, right now things are really messy with the master of chaos in the White House. But the Canadian economy, the Mexican economy, the European economy, the Japanese economy, the Australian economy, South Korean economy, they're all tied into the Chinese to the American economy. And if we think about this, actually, the American economy is not just the American economy; it's all these other economies put together because they have open trade, relatively open trade. They trade technology. They trade in terms of military equipment. So again, the U.S. is head and shoulders above everybody else, followed by China. So that's why I say it's a bipolar world. And where are we headed over the next 10 to 15 years? The Indian economy will grow by all estimates. It will not catch up with China by 2050 or 2060. And that means, again, that the Chinese economy will be the second behind the United States, creating this bipolar system. Now, on the technology front as well, this is where we see again this bipolarity emerge, is that the US and China are the leading technological countries by far in terms of AI and quantum computing, space development. Europe is not there. The EU is, about a 17 trillion, $16 trillion economy. It's hampered by environmental regulation. Other regulations make AI and technology development much slower than the United States and China. So they're not there. So in the technology sphere, it's U.S. and China. In the military sphere, U.S. and China. In economic size, U.S. and China. In terms of economic networks, U.S. and China, by far. So this is why I say we live in a bipolar world. And as we think about where Canada should be, again, our closest geographic neighbor is the United States. Its economy is absolutely huge. It's relatively open, even though we have problems right now with the White House. And this gives Canadian businesses and a huge opportunity to access the U.S. and the Mexican or the North American economy. So how do we negotiate it? We continue to be an indispensable asset to the United States. And
Indispensable. They're talking about making us the 51st state.
we'll never be the 51st state, but we will be an indispensable asset to the United States. And I think the best way to do this is probably three, maybe four, Brian. One is invest in Arctic security. Two is rooting out Chinese foreign interference into our society. Three, invest in heavily in terms of AI and other forms of technology with the United States. And four, and I think really importantly, is energy and critical minerals. So let's start with the first one, Arctic security. Climate change is real. The Arctic is opening up in the summer for longer and longer periods of time. And this means the sea lines of shipping are going to open up. But it also means that we're going to see more Russian and Chinese cooperation in the Arctic in terms of exploring for resources and likely testing the sovereignty claims that Canada has and other countries have in the north. We're likely to see more Russian submarine vessels in that space, as well as Chinese vessels in that space, creating military challenges for the North American continent. So again, can Canada manage the Arctic well? The stronger security we have there, this will reinforce our indispensableness to the United States as protecting the northern flank. Two, rooting out Chinese influence in Canada. I can't tell you how important this is from the United States standpoint, but also from the Canadian standpoint. We've had several commissions in Canada. There's extremely strong evidence that the Chinese have interfered in our democracy and interfere in our by pressuring our Chinese Canadians and influencing their voting patterns. We need to root this out so our democratic system works and that Canadian interests are prioritized as we engage in a global community. And again, I think from the U.S.'s standpoint, the greater foreign influence, in particular Chinese influence in Canada, this creates major security challenges from the United States standpoint. The third area is technology, including AI and quantum computing. We already have great university networks. We need to do more here, again, to be an indispensable asset to the United States. And we already have some great stuff out there on disinformation and cybersecurity. We need to invest in those kinds of programs. So again, the United States sees us as that indispensable asset. Lastly, I think is importantly is critical minerals and energy. The world still runs on energy, and critical minerals are very, very important for the new technologies that we're all using. Those critical minerals, we call them rare earth material. They go in our magnets, they go in our semiconductors, they go in so many aspects of our technologies. And Canada has a lot of them. Canada can be that energy superpower and critical mineral superpower that gives, I think, the United States or gives them leverage and makes them independent from the current country that dominates rare earth materials, China. So I think those four areas are great ways for Canada to be an indispensable partner to the United States, not the 51st state, as I think President Trump has facetiously teased many of our leaders with.
I hope you're right that it's just just a tease, not anything more serious than that. Obviously, you believe in this bipolar world, and you've talked about the strength of the United States economy and the Chinese economy. But you also both in our conversation today and in your articles talk about the challenges that both those
Yes.
economies have. And you and I have talked about this before. I graduated from Harvard Business School in
Yeah.
1988, and
Yeah.
my final exam for business, government, and the international economy was a cover of Foreign Affairs with a picture of Japan, and it said, Japan's going to take over the world. And in 1988, the West thought Japan was going to take over the world,
Yeah.
and it didn't. What happened? And couldn't that happen to China? Couldn't that happen to the United States, given the amount of issues in regards to debt that exist there, and questions on democracy, and the challenges that there's a lot of people in the world that are potentially trying to create alliances, not including the United States.
Right. So in one of the essays that I wrote, Brian, I quote one of the high Chinese officials, Wang Hunin, and I'll send you the paper you can include in the notes for this discussion. His name is Wang Hunin, and he's kind of the brain of the Chinese Communist Party. He's the one that invented the name of the Belt Road Initiative. He's the one that coined the idea of the China Dream. He's the one that coined a lot of these ideas. But back in when you were in Harvard, by the way, back in 88, 89, he toured the United States, and he came back and he wrote a book, America versus America. And he believes that America is unsustainable because of its contradictions and its diversity and its friction in society. But I think what he's doing is he's actually making the wrong conclusion. He's saying that formula is not good for China. China is the most stable when it's highly centralized and it's not diverse and it's homogeneous. And that's what the Chinese government today is trying to do. It's trying to create a country of one language, one culture, one party, because the lesson from the Chinese standpoint is stability, is centrality, central control is what creates stability in China. But in the United States, its whole history has been chaos. It was founded through a war of independence. It rejected the British, rejected their systems, their taxation policy, representation without taxation. It had a civil war to recreate itself. In World War One, it avoided getting involved in World War One to the last minute. It was isolationist. It avoided joining the League of Nations. It voted against at the Paris Peace Accords. It voted against a racial equality clause, which arguably sparked the start of World War II. It had the abolitionist period. It had the anti-Vietnam period, Vietnamese War period. It had the Nixon crisis. Like, how many crises has this country had? And each time it comes out stronger. It recreates and reinvents itself. And it reinvents itself in ways that are unimaginable. I encourage you to think about this. Um, 9/11 happened. The United States went to war with a man named called Saddam Hussein, and the next president of the United States was named uh, Barack Hussein Obama. This is the kind of change that the United States can endure. It recreates itself through chaos, and I believe that again, the United States under President Trump is recreating itself. What it will become, that's an open question, but it's recreating itself through chaos, renegotiating what kind of state it wants to be. What does migration mean? What is the role of the president? What is the role of AI? What is the role of technology? And what is its place in the world? And this is a pattern of behavior. It's not an exception.
You're saying, in fact, the United States is all about chaos, and it deals with it well. It's reliant via through chaos.
I think that its social friction is part of its national DNA, and it's through that social friction and chaos and mass social movements and protests that it recreates itself and creates new ideas of rights and new ideas of the position of different people in society. And back in the 50s, the protests, civil protests against and for racial equality started, and they were widespread. They were violent. Eventually, they created the space for racial equality in the United States. I think the same for the feminist movement emerged through social friction, through the sexual revolution in the 1970s that caused huge chaos. And today, the United States is a much better place in terms of gender equality. I think that over and over we see this kind of conflict domestically that again creates and recreates the United States and how it understands itself. And that is actually something that other countries eventually also absorb. And I think the tensions that we see in the United States also create the space for Canada to evolve how we think about race, or how we think about gender, or how we think about the role of the media or the role of AI. And we see that change comes from the United States because of its size, because of its wealth, because of its social media, because of its entertainment business. It is the place where change emanates from, and that change actually affects every country on the planet. And that's a fascinating thing to think about.
This is a really interesting conversation, Stephen. There was an article just a couple of weeks ago in the Globe and Mail that suggested that there's going to be civil war in the United States. This week there's protests because of ICE
Yep.
activities in the United States. Many people take a look at the incredible partisan ship within the United States and the polarity in the United States of the electorate and of social opinions, etc., and see that as a weakness. You actually see that as a strength.
Yes, I think the United States functions through social tension. Uh, how much it can absorb is a really interesting question, but I think when we think about today, is it so much more than, let's say, in the anti-Vietnam protest period? And I was just born in that period, so I have no direct experience. But what I understand is the anti-Vietnamese protests were widespread. They got violent. Many people, it fundamentally changed many aspects of the United States. I think when we think about, Black Lives Matter, just that was just 10 years ago. And, this protest, pulled the United States in many different directions. But at the end of the day, the United States started to become more aware that, of course, people of color are prejudiced by the police, and they've tried to create some steps to move this in a different direction. So I think it's this social tension and their ability of the United States through civil society to work things out is something that is incredibly it's an incredible strength, although it's incredibly messy. And not many countries do this well, if at all. And the counterexample in Japan, we don't have social protests like this at all. And you would think that they would have social protests because the economy has been relatively stagnant for 30 years, but no. Korea is very, 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 their civil society is very, they have huge tensions in their society as well. And in some ways, it's reminiscent to the United States. China doesn't have this. And this is not because they don't have social tension, it's because the state has put so much controls domestically to avoid these from happening, to avoid instability spreading, so it creates political instability. The United States is very much comfortable with this kind of social chaos in a way that I think even Canada, being a close neighbor, is not comfortable with this much tension. And it's fascinating to watch. And I think, again, it's important to look not just at the past 5 years, but look at America's history over the past 250 years to see that it's a society that's always negotiated chaos through social friction and then recreating itself to build something usually better and stronger and more innovative.
Sat down with Prime Minister Mark Carney and you had to give him some advice. Would you say, given this chaos, this curated chaos, given the social tension, given how things can change so dramatically in the United States, some people are saying just wait it out to the midterms or wait it out till 2028 and maybe a Democrat becomes president? Or do you have to engage right now?
Well, let's borrow Wayne Gretzky's comment is that why he was so great. He wasn't playing with the puck here. He was going to where the puck would be. And I think for Prime Minister Mark Carney, again, he needs to think about where the United States will be in 2 and 5 and 10 years and how Canada can be that indispensable ally. And I gave you four solid steps, right? Prioritize Arctic defense, rooting out Chinese interference in our society, um, focusing on technology, AI, and then lastly, again, being that energy and critical minerals superpower that makes Canada indispensable to the United States. That means investing in infrastructure domestically. That means taking down interprovincial borders. That means dealing with the succession movements in Canada and trying to balance relations between the provinces better. That means removing, I think, some of the identity politics and creating a more cohesive Canadian society. All of this needs to be done domestically. So that's I guess my big tip is, where is the United States heading? And let's aim for that direction rather than think about now. And those four areas I think are great areas to invest in. We have incredible advantages as Canadians, and that's a really great place to start. Second, start to build some strong partnerships with partners of the US, like Australia, like South Korea, like Japan. Those are the priority partners for the United States. And if we can be a priority partner, then we're going to be at the table, not on the menu, as the United States starts to do more of this unpredictable stuff like taking out the leader of Venezuela. Lastly, and I think really importantly, is always to be disciplined in your communication. Whether we like President Trump or not, I think the leaders should always demonstrate respect towards each other and keep their private thoughts to themselves and make sure their cabinet does the same. And every time a cabinet member of Mark Carney or Mark himself says something bad about Mr. Trump, that goes right back to Mr. Trump. And this creates tensions in the relationship. And I think it's something easily avoidable and it's something that I think Mark has done pretty well at so far.
Right. Stephen Nagy, thank you so much for joining us. I really enjoyed reading the articles that you were kind enough to send my way, and this has been an excellent conversation with a very important agenda for Canada. Your 4 points, I couldn't agree with more. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Brian. And again, anybody wants to reach out, they're more than welcome. And I'll send you those links to those papers for you to share with your audience.
That's our show for today, everybody. Thank you for joining. I remind you, I'm on every Monday through Friday at 6 o'clock on 960 AM. You can stream online, even from Tokyo, Japan, at www.saga960am.ca. All my podcasts and videos go up on my website, briancrombie.com, as soon as the radio show goes to air. And I also post it on my YouTube channel, on LinkedIn, on podcast servers, etc. So lots of different ways you can get me. Stephen, really appreciate it. Good night, everybody.
Thank you.